Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green, and joining me is Tobias Fenster. Hey, Tobias, how are you doing?
Hi, very good. Happy to be here. How are you?
Great. Welcome back onto the show. Tobias and I did an episode on running .NET apps in containers. That was one of our live shows all the way back in February of this year. And we said we had such a great time, we should do this again. So we're doing it again. And today we're going to talk about dev containers. But before we begin, Tobias, tell folks a little bit more about yourself in case people don't remember seeing you.
Yeah, thanks a lot again for having me. My name is Tobias Fenster. I'm currently a managing director at 4PS in Germany, creating ERP software for construction companies. But traditionally, or in the beginning of my career, I was a developer, still doing some development work, so mostly on the technical side of things, .NET, containers, Docker, that kind of area. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP and a regional director on the community side and a Docker captain.
Excellent. Okay, so back in February, we talked about running .NET apps in containers. And what's the difference between a container and a dev container? What are dev containers?
Yeah, so the basic idea is that like we're putting everything in a container nowadays for production, for test environments, development environments, and so on, where we have everything defined in that Docker file, in that recipe. So basically, we have the whole tech stack, the whole idea in a file that we can put in version control. And now we're doing the same for development. So when you bring a new developer into a project or you switch tech stacks or something like this, it's often a bit difficult to install things and switch around and so on. And the idea for a dev container is to have a description, mostly in a JSON file, if you need also in a Docker file, where it basically says, okay, for this project, I want to use this development environment, this SDK, those tools, and so on. And by that, you have everything configured and can get up running very quickly and easily.
Oh, that's kind of clever. Because one of the main benefits of the container for runtime is that you have a fixed environment.
Indeed.
And if you have to come back to a project 6 months later, a year later, or whatever, then you just run it in that container and your runtime environment hasn't changed. And so you're saying that you can do the same thing for development work. So
Indeed.
whereas on our computers, we always have the latest and greatest of Visual Studio and the latest and greatest of all our NuGet packages. You're saying that there are cases where you want to develop in a fixed environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So
And
how does
and
that
also,
differ from like DevBox? Because DevBox is touted as a great way to spin up a new environment easily.
yeah, I would say the basic idea or the problem that you're solving is very similar. As you mentioned, you have a fixed environment, pre-configured. You can define in an easy way what is installed and what is happening there. The difference for a dev container is that you're not talking about a whole VM like in a DevBox environment, but instead you're just talking about a container. So it's a lot more lightweight. And of course, you can't do front end work or open up Office in your container or something like this. So definitely, there's scenarios where DevBox makes a lot of sense. But if all you need is a container, you can do development in that container. That works
Okay.
perfectly fine in a dev container.
So I have a ton of questions, but before I dive into those, let's see how it works.
Sure. So
And then I'll ask more
let's demo.
questions.
Yeah, perfect. So usually what I think is typical on your shows and also when I do demos is that you start from scratch and build it up. But I absolutely love showing the result on dev containers because it's such an amazing experience. So what I'll do is I'll show you how it looks like in the end. Now, we can now assume that I'm a developer. I want to start working on a specific project, and that project maybe is hosted on GitHub. And what I can do here is I just go into VS Code and say dev containers clone repository in a container volume. And before I do that, let me show you one more thing, which is when I open up a terminal here on my machine and I say .NET, it has no idea what .NET is. So you can see on the host, I only have Docker, in my case, Docker Desktop installed, and I didn't install .NET. So we'll get that from the dev container. So let's go back here and say dev containers clone repository in container volume. yes, I'm hosting this on GitHub. And as an example, we can use a little web application that I created. It asks me for the branch. Let's go with main because there's nothing else anyway. And now if we go into the log, you can see it's cloning the repository, putting it on my machine, and installing or running that dev container. It also immediately figures out here that I have a workspace file. So it basically takes a look at the cloned repository, and I can easily just say, okay, please open the workspace. So
it's
once it's
creating the
starting
dev container on the fly. Is that right?
Indeed. And I cheated a tiny bit. I did this before our demo because otherwise we would have watched it download the image, and that is kind of boring to see the progress bar. So I've cheated a bit, but if you do this for the first time on your own, then it will take a bit longer, maybe 2-3 minutes, but otherwise you will get the same experience because everything is configured, everything is set up, and now I'm basically ready to develop. So
and that
now,
image, you're getting that image from where?
That image is just a public image that is shared by Microsoft. So if we go into the configuration file, in the .dev container folder, there is a dev container.json, and there you can see the configuration. Okay, this is .NET 4.NET 8. There's already .NET 9, I know. There are also preview images, but this is there.
Okay, so this is Windows.NET, but you could choose other operating systems, other versions of .NET. There are a number of these existing containers. It comes pre-loaded with
other
Visual Studio Code.
Yes. The interesting thing is the integration in Visual Studio Code works very well, where basically Visual Studio Code, the client side of it is still running on my machine, in this case on a VM, but could also be on a laptop. And the server side of Visual Studio Code is running inside of the container. So it has access to the sources, to binaries, to debugger, and so on. But on the client side, I only basically have the front end, if you want to say so, in VS Code. So the client and the server is running in the container as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So without doing anything else, just to show you, I can now easily do a .NET because now I'm in the container. You can also probably tell by the structure here that this is actually a Linux container. That's worth mentioning. Dev containers only work in Linux containers, but with the great Windows subsystem for Linux, the runtime works very easily in Windows as well. So this is a Windows host running a Linux container, by now very, very easily set up, for example, with Docker Desktop, but other options are out there as well. And now I'm running in a Docker container in Linux. As you can see, I have now .NET because this is the .NET image that we used, and then I can start developing. Just go in here, say I want to launch this application. And now it's already launching. I already had last time some breakpoints defined, so you can see here, okay, this is my source code. I can do debugging as if this was running natively, so no difference from a container. And if we from running in the container, and if we just continue, switch it off because this is in a loop. So now I have the application, and you can see here this looks as if it was running on localhost. So basically, the experience as a developer is extremely close to just running it directly on the VM or on the laptop.
Awesome. And then you can you save that? You can obviously save the changes to the dev container locally. Can you then upload that yourself so that you could call it up from somewhere else? Let's say you're on the road, you're on a different computer or whatever. You could.
So, what we're basically doing here is I'm running this on a VM. So now I'm already connected to a VM. I can do this also via an SSH connection. So it could be a VM running somewhere in Azure, which is actually my standard setup. So that works as well. And also, if you know about GitHub code spaces, that's
Yep.
basically the same technology. There you also have a dev container JSON, and you can put you use basically the same technology. It's just that you're no longer controlling the dev container, but the dev container is controlled for you by GitHub. But at the end of the day, that's the same experience and the same technology.
So is the container image that you're using right now is local, right? You download it, it's on your machine,
Yeah.
right? And then you make changes to source code, you might make changes to the actual development environment, save it, it's still local, and then you can
Yeah.
upload it to any container registry, whether it's Azure.
No,
Is that the way it
you
works?
No, you would not change the image. Typically, you can make changes to the image, but that is really if you, for example, you don't need only .NET, but you might use another tool, some image conversion library or whatever is needed for your development
Okay.
workspace. Then you might put it into the image, push the image somewhere, and then use it again. But actually, the more typical setup, I would say, is that you use the standard image like I'm now doing. You use the sources locally and just interact with them via GitHub or whatever source control repository you use. You make your changes and you just push them like you usually would. So the container image, you only need to change rarely, I would say. There's a lot of configuration. There's a lot of great standard images, and we can take a look at the selection maybe in a second to give you an idea. But the image you typically wouldn't change. You just make the changes to your sources, and that is then pushed into GitHub or whatever you use.
So let's say in the image you want to install certain extensions or use you want to install certain extensions.
Yeah.
So those are being installed where? Locally on the server, into your Visual Studio Code locally, or into the Visual Studio Code in the dev container locally?
And so this again depends on what kind of an extension it is. So if it's something that is running on the client side, for example, something around a theme or other things that are running on the client side, that would be installed in my local VS Code. If it's something like the C# development kit or a debugging tool or something like this that needs access on the server side, then it would be installed in the container. Still, I wouldn't change the image, but if we go back to the demo, just to show you what that looks like, if we switch back here and I go back into the dev container JSON file, you can, for example, see here which extensions I want to use. So I would put it in the configuration file that I want to use devkit and gitlens and copilot and a resix editor. And what then happens is when the container starts, it's still the standard image, but it would on top install those extensions automatically. So the image doesn't change. My local container is the same. It gets those changes, so the extensions are installed in my local container. But because I have it here in this configuration file, everyone else who is using the same configuration will also get those extensions automatically.
Okay, now I understand. I got it. Okay, so it's the dev container JSON file, which contains your customizations that you want to have standard across time, basically.
Yeah, and also maybe across teams. So if you decide as a team, we always want to work in a specific way, we always want to set up those extensions, or we want to run something specifically, you can see here the example that comes with the standard dev container JSON file is, once it is created, I always want to run a .NET restore, but that could be literally anything else that you want to run in a terminal. You can put this in the dev container JSON file and share this with your team via standard version control, which is extremely powerful because then you're pretty sure that things work very, very similarly between different developers and also in development and in production later because it's all standardized in the same way.
Okay. And then let's say you are a scenario where you're developing against a specific instance of SQL Server. So can you install SQL Server version whatever, assuming you have access to it, would that be installed into the image? Or where would that get installed?
Yeah, typically something that big that takes a long time to install, you probably would make the change to the image. And
Okay.
by now, there are even predefined images that come with SQL Server. The other option is that you can also have not only one dev container, but multiple dev containers that interact with each other. So you
Okay.
could also imagine I have a front end that's somewhere developed in JavaScript with, I don't know, whatever the latest JavaScript front-end technology is at the moment. Then I have a .NET backend maybe, or I develop in different areas a Blazor front-end and a .NET backend, also possible. And then I add a SQL Server container for persistence as well. So that way I would have a combination of 3 dev containers running next to each other, all defined in those JSON files.
Okay.
And then I could start them all together, connect multiple instances of VS Code to the different dev containers, and then do development against each other.
Cool. All right. And so then if you download an image, make a change to it, and then you want that to be usable from multiple computers, you would then upload the image to a repository. I mean, somewhere you got to upload that local version somewhere, right?
Yeah,
And where
indeed.
does
So
that go?
if you really need to make a change, then you would push it into a container registry, typically on Azure, on GitHub, on whatever you use, and then
Got
others
it.
could use it
Okay.
as well. But that's basically the same for running containers in production. So for your runtime,
Yeah.
as in development, you want to make a change to the image, you can do that. You push it into a repository, and then someone else could use the same.
Okay. So give us more of a sense of what use cases and what scenarios make this something that you really need or would really benefit from.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan, so probably I'm a bit biased, but I typically do development in dev containers whenever I can. And so the answer for me is actually a bit different. When wouldn't I use a dev container? And that is if I definitely have to do development in Windows. So not only the host is Windows, as you've now seen, but really development needs to happen in Windows. That's unfortunately currently not possible. Or if I need to install something that needs a GUI, that also doesn't work. But everything else, which probably is 95% of the dev scenarios out there, work great in a container. And yeah, so by now I'm so used to it that when I come across a project that isn't in a dev container, it's kind of annoying for me, because then I need to figure out, okay, what's the tech stack? Which, I don't know, Node.js version do I need to install? Which C# version do I need to install? And almost always the first step I do, if I know it's something that's not just a one-off, but I keep working on that project, I add a dev container configuration because it's so much more convenient.
Okay. So if you're always building on a particular version of .NET or a particular version of C#, then it would be a lot easier. I mean, you can, when you create a new project, you can pick your version in Visual Studio, for example. You can always go into the project file and target a different version.
Yeah.
But you're basically running on the current. You either have to then install it, make sure you have that particular version installed, or you're running on the latest version and then hoping that you don't use anything that isn't in the version of .NET. So in that case, it does totally make sense to create it once in that container, and then
Yeah.
regardless of what you have on your machine, you're always guaranteed to go back to that specific dev environment with specific versions of everything very
Yeah.
easily. Okay, so that makes
Indeed.
total sense.
Yeah. Or imagine if your project then moves forward and you decide to adopt a new version. Like you mentioned, you would make the change in your project file, but you also would make the change in a dev container JSON file to say, now I no longer want to work with .NET 8, but now I want to work with .NET 9. And
Sure.
once other people are pulling that code change, what happens is in VS Code, they get a little notification that says, oh, your dev container JSON file has changed. Do you want to rebuild your container? And if they say yes, then it takes a look at the dev container JSON, sees, okay, now we're on .NET 9, and it would download the latest standard image, put everything in place, and everyone is running on the same version again. So that is also, especially when working in teams, a great mechanism to let others know, look, we're now making a step forward, we're adding an additional tool, we try to work with an additional extension, or we want to work with a new version of something, because it's all version control in your Git repository.
And it kind of makes sense if you're using containers at runtime with a specific environment. That absolutely makes sense to make any additional development in a matching environment, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
That's the old it does work on my machine story where we're trying to be as close as possible between development and production, to make sure that you don't see a difference in QA and in user acceptance testing, and suddenly in production it doesn't work anymore. So we worked on all this containerization stuff to make sure across the different stages it's always the same. But locally, people are just installing left and right, whatever makes sense. So I fully agree to have that fixed as well. Makes a ton of sense, because then you're sure everyone is working on the same version with the same tech stack, and actually also very close to what you then end up in production with.
So to get started with this, so let's say I decide, okay, it makes a huge amount of sense. I'm going to start using dev containers. I need Docker desktop, right?
It's definitely the most convenient way, yes.
Yeah. And then if I haven't done it before, how long does it typically take to download an image, get it set up? Here you had done it before, so it was pretty bang. But if I'm starting from scratch, is it 10 minutes, half an hour, 2 hours?
No. 10 minutes should actually be enough, 5 to 10 minutes. If you have a pre-existing repository, if you take just one of the examples, then it's like 5 to 10 minutes. We can also maybe use the time to walk quickly through what do you need to do to set it up for yourself. But you will see that's also more like a 5 to 10 minute exercise.
Okay.
So if we close this one and close the remote connection, so this is basically now closing the connection to the running dev container. All I need is the dev container extension in VS Code here. So as you mentioned, Docker Desktop installed, so I can run Linux containers with the Windows subsystem for Linux. And then we have the dev container extension here. And what I can now do is, let me just go to my desktop and add a new folder, demo dev container, and then say that we open that folder just to show you desktop dev container. This is just an empty folder because we just created it. And what I now can do is I can say dev container open folder in container. So I use the same folder, and now it asks me, okay, do you want to add a configuration to that workspace folder, or do you want to have it as a user? I'll put it in the workspace so I can later share it with others via source control, as also is the comment here. And now I'm getting to this selection that I wanted to share with you before, where I can see, and this is actually just the recommended ones, the amazing stuff of predefined templates that are already in here. So I want to do .NET development. So let's say .NET. And again, you can see it comes with an Azure SQL connection, with Aspire, with .NET.js. But let's for now only go with a standard C#.NET. I select the version here. Okay, I'll accept the default. Now I can add a ton of additional features. Again, I'm just scrolling here. So whatever additional tool you need, whatever additional thing you need in your tech stack, chances are good that you already have a features in the dev container standard pre-selection that you will find. But for now, I also skip the feature. Optional files, I'll also skip that for now. But what it now does is it reopens my folder, the empty folder that we have created, takes a look at that dev container JSON file that has been created, and it's already up and running. Again, this would take maybe 5 minutes for you to download the image. But for me, because I have that image already, you can see this is exactly the same that we've used before. Now I'm basically ready to do development. I can now go in and say .NET new web API. And now I have my new web API, as you can see here. I could go into run and debug. For that, just need to create a launch JSON file. Oh no, I would need the C# extensions. Okay, it's a bit more work. Let's see.
Okay.
Let's add them. VS Code launch JSON. No, actually we are here. We have the launch JSON. Let me hit F5 again. Oh yeah, now it's doing a .NET build. It's running my little web API. It's starting. Oh yeah, and I need to install developer certificates, but the error message immediately gives me what I need to do. Let's go back into the terminal, do that, and try to run again. The beauty of live demos, but I really hope now we're done. Yeah, here we go. It's a self-signed certificate, so I need to accept it. And if we go to /Swagger, the standard for the web API, I know we're up and running. So you see, it basically took me 5 minutes. Now I'm in the dev container, and I can start development.
Awesome. And you can do these with Visual Studio as well. I know you're a VS Code guy, but this would also work as a Visual Studio developer. There are ways to do that?
I think Visual Studio has started to support dev containers as well, yes.
Okay. So we'll put some notes, I'll put some links in the show notes on where people can learn more about that, but it obviously works extremely well in VS Code.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. What else did we know about this as we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, once you dig into it, we've now seen this is the standard setup. Now we want to probably add some extensions and so on. And I would, again, click through the whole lifecycle here. But my big encouragement to people really would be, okay, if you have a project that is currently running not in a dev container, try to put it in a dev container or start from scratch like you've seen here, because it's that easy. And that's really my experience. Once you tried it, once it works for you, you don't want to go back, because it makes so much things a lot easier. It's everything standardized, everything's repeatable. You don't need to worry about switching between tech stacks. So yeah, I really like it. If you're a developer working, I don't know, 95% with the same technology, same version, same tech stack, then maybe it's not as attractive. But if you're switching a bit back and forth between technologies, if you're onboarding new people and so on, then I can only highly recommend it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And would it help in a situation where you're working on a project with others and they're not necessarily on the latest version of VS Code? I mean, obviously, as soon as there's an update, I install the update. I actually start looking for it before it's been released half the time, because I know it's monthly. But oh my God, it's today's September 30th. There's probably a new version, so I'm going to launch VS Code just to get the new version. But not everybody's like that. Not everybody's constantly on the latest version. So this would be a way of, across the project, making sure everybody's using the exact same version, right? Is that another scenario?
Yes. Not necessarily for VS Code, because you still have the client component in VS Code, and that could be older across people. But I would say, at least in my experience, the changes when something works or doesn't work mostly is more related to the tech stack, to the SDKs and so on. And that you can very much standardize. Yeah.
There you go. All right. Perfect. I love it. And I love that it's easy to set up and easy to use. And there didn't seem to be any performance issues. I mean, seem to be working pretty fast.
Yeah, it's the same as your host, I would say. I mean,
Yeah.
if you take this to the extreme and are running, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 containers at the same time, then depending on your machine, you might run into issues. But really, I would say it's the same performance locally versus in a dev container. There's no noticeable overhead for me.
Awesome. Well, this has been very cool. Thanks so much for coming on and showing us how this works and how easy it is.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Hope you guys enjoyed that, and we will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.